Welcome to the Basic LGBTQ Affirming Information for Therapists with the Center on Colfax. I will be your facilitator, Alexis Chavez. A brief description about myself. I'm a psychiatrist by training. I'm the founder of multiple award-winning LGBTQ mental health clinics, and I'm also the former medical director of the Trevor Project, the world's largest LGBTQ suicide prevention organization. I've worked with the center for many years, where I was formerly on the board of directors. During my time there, I also gave full-day trainings to make therapists more LGBTQ affirming in ways just like this one. I'm really excited to help guide you through these slides today. These are a few of the terms that you might have heard before or that you may hear in the future that identify members of the LGBTQ community. Keep in mind, this list is far from all-inclusive. Here are some of the flags that you might have seen at Pride, at community centers, or other. Here are some of the symbols that may represent different identities rather than writing it or typing it out. When we talk about gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, it's helpful to have something that we can look at that rather than just hearing these words. So the gender unicorn is one example that can help us do that. Gender identity is an innate feeling of one's manness or womanness, and it's a deeply ingrained feeling that has no correlation with what sex someone was assigned at birth. Some people may choose to identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, and some people may not. Similarly, gender expression or presentation is another aspect that may or may not be the same as the sex assigned at birth or the gender identity. People may decide to have short hair or long hair. They may have a very masculine or feminine presentation. Their sexual attraction to women, men, both, another, other, or none of the above, or similarly, their romantic attraction is also an independent construct from the gender identity, from the sex assigned at birth, or someone's expression. That is to say, you can't just look at somebody and know who they're sexually or romantically attracted to, nor can you look at someone and know immediately what their gender identity is. Gender identity is solidified when someone is very young, even as young as a few years old, but the expression of gender identity may be influenced by a number of other outside factors. For example, someone may feel pressure to perform in a certain way, to have a certain expression of gender identity based on what their family wants. They may feel that there's a certain way that one is supposed to be, and they have to follow that. Regardless of what someone's gender expression is, it's always valid. Here are some historical attitudes towards LGBTQ people. To give a historical perspective to this, in 1933, thousands of people were sent to Nazi concentration camps. Each group of people that were deemed unwanted by society were given a particular color of badge. Homosexuals, as they were called, were given a pink badge. Of note, it was particularly applied to male homosexuality rather than female homosexuality. The pink triangle has since been reclaimed in many LGBTQ circles. In 1952, homosexuality was classified as a personality disorder in the very first DSM-1. It was not until 20 years later that homosexuality or any sort of relation to that was finally removed from any DSMs. Gender identity disorder was included since DSM-3. It was also believed to be a mental health disorder, much like homosexuality originally was. Gender identity disorder was later renamed gender dysphoria in the most recent DSM-5, but there's a push to completely remove gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria or any sort of stigmatizing language from this at all, and to move it out of mental health disorders entirely. In 1987, the AIDS crisis became a national issue. It was originally called gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. It was believed that there was something specifically about being homosexual that was, or gay, that could cause what was later known as HIV. In 1993, President Clinton signs the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, barring LGBTQ people from openly serving in the military. In 1996, he also signed the Defense of Marriage Act, also called DOMA, which prevented the government from recognizing gay and lesbian marriages. And in 2008, California's Prop 8 makes same-sex marriages illegal. For a trans historical perspective, in 1966, Compton's cafeteria in the Tenderloin District was one of the few places where trans people who were not welcome at gay bars could congregate publicly. Riots broke out there after police officers tried to kick out a trans woman. Members of the LGBTQ community picketed the restaurant after it prohibited trans people from entering. In 1999, infantry soldier Barry Winchell was murdered by his fellow soldiers after they discovered he was in a relationship with a trans woman. The Trans Day of Remembrance that same year was held on November 20th. Every year, hundreds of trans and nonconforming people are attacked and murdered. TDOR, or TDOR as it's sometimes called, is a time for us to honor their memories. And in Texas this same year, they refused to issue a marriage license to opposite-sex couples where one partner is trans. When we talk about economic factors, in 1952, President Truman banned homosexuals from federal jobs. Thousands at the time were fired. In 1992, Colorado denied LGBT people any protections against discrimination. We have later seen various iterations of this. Although Colorado subsequently established very clear protections for LGBTQ people based on sexual orientation or gender identity, other states have since enacted measures that have prevented LGBT people from discrimination. Here are some of the voices of the 40s and the 50s of LGBTQ people. Here's a poem by Langston Hughes. Detectives from the Vice Squad with weary sadistic eyes spotting fairies. Degenerates, some folks say. But God, nature, or somebody made them that way. Police lady or lesbian over there. Where? Some of the voices of the 60s and 70s. Some further examples of attitudes towards LGBTQ individuals in the military, in law enforcement, in the media, in other press, in advertising. Some of the early pioneers with sexual orientation and gender identity included Alfred Kinsey with his well-known Kinsey scale, and Harry Benjamin, who established standards that would later go to inform the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, or WPATH, as it's currently known today. We'll talk a bit through some of the terms that people use for different identities. These are some of the identities that people use for LGB. In fact, lesbian, gay, and bisexual are the terms that create the acronym LGB. Various terms you may hear related to the A identity is ace, agender, aromantic, or asexual. You may also hear something like same gender loving. It's used as an alternative, but to words like gay or lesbian, more commonly by members of the African American and Black community. For the Q identities, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that even though queer is used widely by members of the LGBTQ community, it's still not considered universally accepted, especially because of the historical context of the derogatory way in which it used to be used. It's been since reclaimed, but it's important to not use it for people who don't identify in this way. Feel free to pause the presentation to take some time to read through any of these identities. The next thing that we'll talk about are various ways to raise behavioral health awareness for LGBTQ people. Minority stress is a unique type of chronic stress faced by members of stigmatized minority groups. It's best understood in 3 steps. The first is that members of minority groups are subject to negative events such as harassment and discrimination on a regular basis. The second part is that leads to the expectation that future negative events of discrimination and harassment or other such events are going to happen again. And the third part is the internalization. Because of this chronic awareness, the internalization of society's negative attitudes can lead to feelings of worthlessness, of negative well-being. It can be a detriment to one's health. It can lead to things such as thinking, I am bad, or being gay is bad. Minority stress is not benign. Individuals of minority groups can experience harassment, exclusion, abuse, victimization on a daily basis. And this is in addition to smaller, what we call microaggressions, which they might experience, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. The internalization of these negative things that LGBTQ people experience every day leads to higher rates of negative behavioral health outcomes, including PTSD, anxiety, depression, and others. It's not just mental health disparities that LGBTQ people face as a result of minority stress. If we think about the chronic stress that people experience every day, this directly translates into poorer physical health outcomes. Compared to heterosexual individuals, LGBTQ individuals have higher rates of asthma, allergies, osteoarthritis, and many other things. Safe restroom access is a thing of critical importance for transgender people. They're at higher risk of experiencing verbal harassment, physical assault when attempting to use public restroom facilities. They may try to hold it the entire day to avoid using a public restroom, and this can lead to urinary tract infections and other problems. It's not only restrooms that transgender individuals may experience harassment or discrimination in. People may also avoid shopping malls, gyms, retail stores, or really any public place. We'll move on to talk about how aging uniquely affects LGBTQ individuals. LGBTQ older adults have been uniquely affected by the way that changing attitudes towards LGBTQ people have evolved over time. As a result of this, most of LGBTQ older adults live alone, They may never have had a partner. They may not even have known anybody that was out before. And so it's very isolating in a way that's unique to older adults. In addition, their families may have been more likely to be rejecting of them. They may be estranged from their siblings or other relatives. They're also less likely to access health and social services for fear of being exposed or being outed. As a result of family ostracism, LGBTQ older adults often rely on families of choice, which we'll get to here in a second. Families of choice are those individuals which somebody chooses that they are close to. They may not be related by blood, but they're people that they find the closest in their lives, who understand that they are the ones who will be close to them and will support them in times of need. Many LGBTQ older adults do not have children to care for them, whether that's because they've been ostracized or disowned by their own children, or because they never had children of their own in the first place. Having a lack of close family members puts LGBTQ older adults more at risk of premature institutionalization as well. As a result of this, many LGBTQ older adults may seek to go back into the closet or non-disclosing their identity as a member of the LGBTQ community. And they do this in order to protect themselves because they're not sure how they will be perceived, either in perhaps a nursing home that they might be in, or in the communities. There are very different attitudes among older people oftentimes, and so some of their peers may not be as accepting. And so this can really be an issue of safety for many older adults. As a result of all this isolation, they often experience depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. These are issues that often go under-recognized for older adults. For LGBTQ people of color, who experience multiple intersecting minority identities of race, sexuality, or gender identity, the need for family and culture may outweigh their need to be out about who they are and their own identity. Next, we move on to building transgender awareness. There are many transgender people all around you, people and whose names or faces you may recognize. Transgender, also abbreviated trans, is an umbrella term that refers to any people who don't identify with their assigned gender at birth. Here are some of the many words you might hear that all fall under the transgender umbrella. Transgender may be a category that many of these people might identify with along with another identity, but not necessarily. For example, someone might identify as being both genderqueer and transgender. When we think back to the minority stress model and how frequent, objective, external, discriminatory events can lead to the future expectation of these events and thus worse mental health and physical health outcomes, it's no surprise to us that transgender Coloradans, compared to all Coloradans, experience higher rates of unemployment and higher rates of earning less than $25,000 per year, despite having a high level of college degrees. Furthermore, if we talk about some of the mental health challenges that transgender Coloradans experience, they have much, much higher rates of depression, anxiety, of contemplating or even of attempting suicide. transgender Coloradans have indicated that there are many reasons why they have barriers to accessing healthcare. The first of which is cost, which also goes hand in hand with what we said on the last slide, that they are much more likely to make less than $25,000 per year than other Coloradans. But also fear of discrimination, not having health insurance, or not having good enough coverage for insurance are all some of the top reasons that people have barriers to accessing healthcare. When we think about the other side of Colorado physicians, nearly 1 in 5 Colorado physicians report that they never ask patients about their sexual orientation or gender identity, that about 1 in 5 report that they would disapprove of brochures or posters in the waiting room that relate to LGBTQ issues. And the same proportion of transgender folks report being refused medical care. In terms of employment, 90% of transgender people report job harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination, and 71% report that they have attempted to avoid discrimination by hiding their gender or gender transition. "53% of trans people report being verbally harassed or disrespected in a place of public accommodation, and about half of trans people report having to teach their medical providers about transgender care. Altogether, there are many barriers that trans people are experiencing every day just in order to be present in their daily lives. Cisgender, also abbreviated cis, is a term for people who have a gender identity that matches their assigned sex. Cisgender privilege can be thought of the flip side to the discrimination and harassment that transgender individuals face every day. Cisgender privilege is the ability to live without ever having to think about any of these things. For example, your validity as a person is not based on how much surgery you've had or how well you quote-unquote passed as not transgender. As a cis person, you have the freedom to walk through the world and blend in, not being constantly stared or gawked at, whispered about, pointed at, or laughed at because of your gender expression. If you end up in the emergency room, you don't worry that your gender will keep you from receiving appropriate treatment or that your medical issues will be seen as a result of your gender. Nobody asks about your genitals and how you can have sex. There's a concept that's sometimes referred to as a trans broken arm, in that if a transgender person goes to the emergency room, they might be asked about their genitals, regardless of the fact that that doesn't actually matter for a broken arm. Here are some other examples of cisgender privilege to think about. Even if you benefit from cisgender privilege, you can use that to make a difference in trans lives. Here are some examples to think about. And a few more examples. When we talk about the prevalence of gender markers, I first want to start by giving an example of how many things we encounter on a daily basis that have a gender marker on them. Take a look at some of these and see if some of them surprise you, or if you've even thought about how many of these have those on them. For transgender individuals, just like everyone else, you need consistent and accurate IDs to open bank accounts, start a job, enroll in school, or travel. However, changing a name or changing a gender marker is complex and sometimes prohibitively expensive. Some states don't allow you to change a gender marker on your birth certificate or on your identity documents, and others that do allow you to don't allow you to change it without having a documentation of surgery, which is not something that all transgender people are going to want or be able to afford. As such, it's no wonder that only 21% of trans people have updated all of their IDs and records with their correct gender. 41% report living without IDs that match their gender identity. And the ability to not have these identity documents has a wide range of impact. We touched on microaggressions earlier and how they can be very insidious, how they relate to the minority stress model, and how they can be very pervasive in ways that are difficult to detect. We'll touch on how some of them might be related to transgender people in this part. Let's start off with the definition of microaggression. Microaggressions are statement, actions, or incidents regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a sexual or ethnic minority. And that's where the microaggression comes from, is its subtlety. Microaggressions don't make them any less harmful, and they don't make them any less detrimental to the health of minority individuals. Misgendering is labeling a person as having a gender other than the one they identify with. Misgendering transgender people is one form of microaggression. Here are some microaggression examples for you to read through. Have you ever heard these ones? We can think of microaggressions against sexual orientation or gender identity as falling under one of these 6 categories. Language around LGBTQ identity, much like any other language, evolves over time. Here's an example of some terms that may have been used before that are generally considered outdated or offensive and should be avoided, and some replacements that you can use instead. Now we move on to LGBTQ youth awareness. Take a look at some of these numbers to better understand how discrimination against LGBTQ people can particularly affect young people. I'll give you some time to look at these. Remember, these disparities are not because of anything that's wrong with LGBTQ youth, but rather because of the discrimination that's experienced against sexual orientation and gender identity. Which one of these stats that we've looked at have stuck out to you? When we talk about the struggles for LGBTQ youth of color experience additional challenges because of the intersectionality of multiple minority statuses. That is, they have to face discrimination both for being a racial minority as well as for being a minority for their sexual orientation or gender identity. LGBTQ youth of color are less likely to be involved in social and cultural activities, and many feel pressure to choose between their ethnic group and their gender or sexual identities. Ultimately, many people choose where they can find the most support. When we look at the percentage of youth that are out to their parents, and we break it down by racial or ethnic minority, we can tell that these numbers tell a story of additional challenges that youth of color may be experiencing. Next, we're going to talk about Native American or Two-Spirit identity awareness. Two-Spirit is a Native American word that refers to men and women who self-identify and possess both male and female attributes or spirits. Keep in mind that Two-Spirit should not be culturally appropriated to people who are not Native American. The Two-Spirit identity is one of the most widely shared features of North American societies. It's found all over the continent in many different archaeological evidence. The way that people adopted a Two-Spirit identity in most tribes was based on their interests and skills. In some groups, gender assignments were based on an ancestor that they were given the name of, and they were raised in accordance with the wishes of this ancestor, according to the gender of the ancestor, regardless of the child's sex assigned at birth. Next, we'll touch on intersex awareness. Intersex describes variations in sex characteristics that don't typically fit our binary notions of male or female. Sometimes that means differences in external genitalia. Sometimes that means a difference in chromosomes or in hormonal response. Here you can see the prevalence of various intersex conditions. Overall, the prevalence of people whose bodies don't neatly fit into a standard male or female body is probably about 1 in 100. So if I think about my graduating high school class was about 200 people, that means statistically probably 2 people in that class fell into this category. The question arises, how can we best center the client with the practice model if the client is intersex? So it's helpful for the whole family to receive psychological support. It's important for no surgeries or cosmetic treatments to be performed on the person until they have the ability to understand what is happening and provide consent for themselves. However, any medical problems should be treated accurately and adequately. Lastly, we'll talk about best practices for making your office more LGBTQ affirming. It's important to provide each person the same level of care, regardless of your personal feelings or beliefs. Even if we don't necessarily agree with what's happening, it's important to recognize and affirm the dignity of each person. If you're working with LGBTQ older adults, ask them to tell stories from you. Ask them to tell stories from their past, just as you would from anyone else. Acknowledge and recognize LGBTQ folks in the materials that you have around your office. If you have marketing materials, include images of same-sex couples. If you have magazines in the waiting room, for example, try to include things that demonstrate also examples of same-sex couples. Ask about pronouns for every person that comes in, and tell them your own. For myself, I use pronouns Hershey, like the chocolate bar. We have to assume that LGBTQ people are present in all of the groups that we see. One of the groups that might seem invisible at times is older adults. It's estimated that about 3 to 10% of the population falls somewhere within the LGBTQ umbrella. So that means there's probably between 1 to 3 almost million LGBTQ older adults. This is also relevant for each group of ages that we work with. Just because we don't know that somebody is LGBTQ doesn't mean that they don't identify that way. It may mean that they haven't told us yet, either because it hasn't been a topic of conversation, or perhaps they don't even feel comfortable yet talking to us about that. If you see something in your organization that doesn't sit right with you, speak up about it. If you hear someone that says a comment that's anti-LGBTQ, if you hear someone that's not using affirming pronouns for somebody, speak up and encourage everyone to do better about it. If you're not saying anything, it might give the impression that you're agreeing with what's being said. It's also important to think about whether we are segregating different genders based on the restrooms that we have, the changing rooms, the locker rooms, or other types of logistical implementations. That's the end of the slides that we have. If you'd like to learn more, go to the Center on Colfax website at www.lgbtqcolorado.org. Thanks for sitting with us, and I hope you've learned a lot. Also, feel free to check out these national resources for even more excellent information. This presentation is dedicated to the following people, as well as the many countless thousands of LGBTQ activists now and throughout history. And a special thanks and recognition to all the mental health committee members that have helped to make this possible. Thanks again.